Okay, so when you hear the title Gulliver's Travels, what actually pops into your head? Maybe you picture a really whimsical children's book, or, perhaps that lighthearted comedy movie featuring a giant guy tied down by tiny people on a beach. But here's the thing. The popular whimsical perception of this classic text couldn't possibly be further from its actual reality. Jonathan Swift's masterpiece is absolutely not a bedtime story. It is a dark, biting, and ultimately deeply misanthropic teardown of human nature and society.
So we really have to ask, is Gulliver's Travels just a fairy tale? I mean, it's super easy to look at the fantastical elements, the tiny little Pushins, the giant Brobdingnagians, floating islands, and, talking horses, and just write the whole thing off as pure fantasy. But Swift was brilliant. He used these fantastical settings as a literal Trojan horse. He was actually smuggling in some of the harshest, most brutal criticisms of 18th century European politics, religion, and just humanity in general that had ever been written.
Just to give you a real taste of the tonal whiplash this book delivers, listen to this totally unfiltered assessment from the giant king of Brobdingnag. This is right after he listens to Gulliver brag endlessly about human society. He says, "How contemptible a thing was human grandeur, which could be mimicked by such diminutive insects as I." Ouch, right? The king isn't impressed by our wars, our fancy titles, or our politics. To him, human beings are literally nothing more than petty insects playing dress-up.
To truly wrap our heads around this complex four-part piece of literature, we need a roadmap. So, in today's explainer, here's our agenda. First up, the man behind the satire. Second, a matter of perspective. Third, the dangers of extreme knowledge. Fourth, discovering the inner Yahoo. And finally, Swift's ultimate warning. Let's dive in.
All right, kicking things off with Section 1, the man behind the satire and his historical motives.
To really understand the sheer sharpness of Swift's commentary, we have to look at the world he was living in. In the early 18th century, Britain's political atmosphere was just incredibly volatile. For years, the conservative Tory party completely dominated politics. But then, in 1714, the liberal Whig party gained serious traction, basically violently pushing the Tories out of prominence. Swift, who was a staunch Tory himself, found himself entirely on the losing end of this massive political shift. He channeled all that frustration into his writing, starting around 1720, finishing the four parts by 1725, and publishing the very first edition in 1726. Fun fact, he actually published it under the pseudonym Lemuel Gulliver, just to add an air of authenticity to this supposedly real travel journal.
So, who was this guy exactly? Well, Jonathan Swift was a man of many hats. He was a politician's secretary, a country parson, and a very outspoken advocate for Irish liberty from England. This incredibly diverse background basically gave him a front-row seat to the political and religious corruption of his society. He even formed a club with other writers specifically resolved to satirize modern knowledge. The crucial takeaway here is that Swift had the absolute perfect arsenal of insider knowledge paired with outsider frustration to completely dismantle the hypocrisy around him.
Moving right along to Section 2, a matter of perspective. Here, we'll explore the symmetrical extremes Swift uses in the first two voyages. To pull off his critique, Swift relies heavily on two massive literary devices, relativism and defamiliarization. Now that's just a fancy way of saying he changes Gulliver's physical scale. By making him a literal giant in one land and then basically a tiny bug in another, Swift takes perfectly normal human behaviors and makes them look utterly absurd. He strips away the familiarity of our world to force us, the readers, to examine our own human flaws with totally fresh eyes. It's like looking at humanity under a microscope. And this brilliantly sets up the juxtaposition between the first two islands. On one side, you have Lilliput. This is a land of tiny people defined by petty physical power, violent force, and these absurd, deadly grudges. On the flip side, we have Brobdingnag. This is a land of giants, defined by immense physical size, but crucially it's coupled with deep moral power, genuine empathy, and an absolute disgust at human inventions like gunpowder. Swift is showing us plain and simple that moral greatness has absolutely nothing to do with physical power. Actually, the tiny Lilliputians are vicious, while the giant Brobdingnagians are surprisingly gentle.
Okay, get this. It sounds completely insane, but in Lilliput, 11,000 people have died in a war over, wait for it, which end of an egg you should break, the larger end or the smaller end. Now, it sounds hilarious at first until you realize this is Swift's defamiliarized critique of the real-world European religious wars between Catholics and Protestants. He's essentially yelling at his society, look at how you're killing each other over minor theological differences. You look just as ridiculous as people going to war over a breakfast egg. It's a pretty stark reminder of how easily human beings still fall into toxic tribalism today over the most trivial things imaginable.
Throughout his travels, Gulliver is constantly observing different societies trying to reach these utopian ideals. But Swift reveals the dangerous consequences of extreme political solutions. Whether it's Lilliput taking children away from their parents just to raise them quote-unquote logically, or tyrants using violence to enforce absolute order, Swift is warning us that there is no perfect magic formula for a state. Extreme ideology usually just leads straight to deep, deep suffering.
Which naturally brings us to Section 3, the dangers of extreme knowledge and its useless abstractions.
As we transition into the third voyage, we get this incredible contrast between two deeply intellectual societies. First, the Laputians. They live on a literal floating island. They are entirely obsessed with abstract math and music, but they lack all common sense. I mean, they can't even build a house with a straight right angle, and their clothes never fit properly. They are the ultimate modern ivory tower thinkers. So caught up in abstract theory, they are completely useless in the real world. Contrast them with the Huyanhums, who we meet a bit later. They are hyper-rational, practical, and actually utilize reason to maintain a truly peaceful functioning society. Swift is making the point that intelligence without any practical application is honestly worse than outright ignorance.
And we also see the dark side of knowledge when it comes to history. During this voyage, Gulliver actually gets the chance to speak with the ghosts of historical figures. And what he realizes is that modern history is basically wearing a mask. It is full of complete fabrications written by what he calls prostitute writers, historians who essentially sell out to elevate fools and cowards while bearing the actual truth. Learning this just fundamentally shatters Gulliver's trust in human institutions.
All right, now we arrive at the climax of our narrative arc, Section 4, Discovering the Inner Yahoo, the Real Beast.
This part of the explainer really forces us to ask a tough question. Who is the real beast? See, back in the 18th century, the common European assumption was that simply possessing a human body automatically made you morally and rationally superior to animals. It was a given. But Swift takes this arrogant assumption and completely, utterly flips it on its head in his final voyage. This is where Swift really drops the hammer. Gulliver discovers a land ruled by the Houyhnhnms, and what are they? They're rational, peaceful, civilized horses. They are so virtuous they don't even have a word in their language for evil or lying. It just doesn't compute for them. And who are the beasts of burden in this land? Well, they're called the Yahoos. They are these filthy, greedy, selfish creatures who hoard shiny stones and literally throw excrement at each other. And then comes the horrifying realization for Gulliver: the Yahoos are human beings. Yeah, they are the embodiment of everything gross and crude in human nature, just without the polite mask of civilization to hide behind.
This revelation completely breaks him, which leads us to our final part of the explainer, Section 5, Swift's ultimate warning, total disillusionment. So what happens to a guy after seeing all of this? Well, by the time Gulliver is forced to return to England, his new perspective has entirely transformed him, and not in a good way. He no longer sees himself as a proud, civilized European. He looks in the mirror and sees a Yahoo. His tragic fate is that he cannot function in human society anymore. He actually detests the smell and the sight of his own loving wife and children because he just views them as filthy Yahoos. He ends up spending his days talking to the horses in his stable, completely alienated from his own species. His mind got so open that, well, his brain basically fell out.
And that leaves us with a really profound, lingering question to ponder as we wrap up. Is Gulliver's ultimate descent into complete misanthropy the true enlightenment of a wise man who finally sees humanity for what it actually is? Or is it the tragedy of a man who totally lost his perspective, amplifying human evil way beyond its actual proportions and completely failing to see the good that also exists? Jonathan Swift never gives us an easy answer to that. He simply holds up the mirror, leaving us to decide what we really see looking back at us.